Hello everyone, and welcome to this Energy Meetup. My name is Holmer Bakke, and together with Torstein Nikolaisen, we'll be your hosts for this evening. For the ones that are new to the group, welcome. And here's a little intro about us. We are part of the .NET Foundation, and we are an independent user group with focus on .NET. We tend to focus on talks and subjects based on practical experience, and is by developers for developers. We are also always interested in people that have something to present. If you have something you would like to present, please contact us either by email or by Twitter. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and we also have a Twitch channel. We'd like to thank our sponsors. Without them, this meetup would not be possible to arrange on a regular basis. The NNUG board consists of these people. These are the ones that organizes these meetups. And please contact us if you have any questions or comments.
All right, thanks. And we partner up with Microsoft Norway in NNUG. And we have a cool Microsoft backpack that we will give away to the winner of today's best tech question. So don't be afraid to ask questions. You can also win another backpack by participating in if you learn about developing Linux on Windows and Azure. And there's a link here which we will share. And there's another link here, as you can see, to the Azure Heroes badge. And you can use that link to claim your badge. And Microsoft also kind of told us that there are some folks who have collected a lot of these badges, and they have recently received cool gift boxes. Again, we'll post these links in the chat so you can easily find them and click them. And lastly, Microsoft would like us to announce that they have a tech Twitter account where they announce their community-driven events for developers. So if you would like to follow MSDevNO, you'll get those events. So next slide, please. For today's main event, we have the honor of hosting the great Scott Hanselman. He's here to talk to us about how to develop for Linux and Windows on Windows using WSL. It's a little bit hard to not be star-stricken. And so me and Oddbjørn was joking about being a bit nervous for this session. I think it's going okay so far. Scott told us that he really wants your questions, and I've been allowed to interrupt him during the talk. So feel free to ask those questions, and remember, you can win a cool prize for the best question. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So without further ado, I'll hand the stream over to you, Scott.
Hello. Cool. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I see our friends in the chat on the YouTube. This is a really important reminder to our friends that this is live. This is not a recorded session. I'm here right now. It is 8:04 in the morning here in Portland, Oregon. What would be really great is if you ask questions, because if I just talk to myself, I'm alone in my office here and I'm talking to myself, and that's weird. So what you can do is ask questions, and then our friends at the user group will interrupt me, and we can get our questions answered, and maybe it will be a better talk. And as we said, we'll get a free backpack for anyone who asked an awesome question. So you ask the best question, and then you'll get a backpack, which is cool. First question, actually, before I even started, is: are we going to talk about the CUDA toolkit today? No, we won't. But their build is coming up, so we should hear more about improvements in WSL. Remember that Microsoft build is actually going to be Microsoft build. Let's go and search for that. Is coming up very, very soon. It's going to be, I think it's the 25th. Here we go. Build 2020. Let's try another operating. Let's try another thing here. Dates and schedules. May 25th. There you go. So we should hear some more stuff about schedules and stuff there. So good question about WSL as it relates to CUDA and things like that. Cool. So my name is Scott, and if you don't know me, I work in Portland, Oregon. I work for Microsoft. I would encourage you to take a look at my blog. Lots of interesting stuff up there. And I would particularly encourage you to take a look at my podcast. I've got lots of cool people on the podcast talking about tech. We are coming up on episode 800 podcasts. Sergey is asking in the YouTube if we're going to talk about Windows Terminal. Absolutely. Give me all your Windows Terminal thoughts, and I will share them, because I'm going to be using Windows Terminal as we have our chat here. Cool. So let's actually do that. Let's start. So let's do this. Let me empty my screen here. And if I go to the Start menu and I type in CMD and like do cmd.exe, what we would end up with is we'd end up with this terminal here. Now, we need to make sure that we're clear about the difference between a terminal and a shell. I think that this is confusing because people conflate the two. People combine the two. So this screen here has some strings that were output by the shell, but separate the strings that were output from the pixels that were painted. You see the difference? Question there in the chat. My config for my Windows Terminal is on my blog, and it's on my gists, my GitHub gists. So you can take a look at those, and I'll give you a blog post to look at in a moment. So I'm in DOS, in air quotes. This is the command prompt. It's basically like, dir and things like that. So this shell, the shell is the thing that presents you a prompt and then takes a string. So if I type in dir, the string's output, and you see how it's outputting as fast as it can. One of the bad things about the original command prompt is that if I make this smaller, it actually goes faster because it has less to paint. That's because of a fundamental problem with the architecture where it can't continue the work until the strings actually get output. So let's make sure that we open up Notepad to make this clear to folks. So the shell is doing strings and things like that, and it handles, user input, but it doesn't know about pixels. So the shell did not paint onto the screen. If I open up PowerShell, which is another different terminal, right? Let's go ahead and open that up. We see our text. We have a different prompt. If I type dir or ls, I get something different. We know that the commands in PowerShell are different. In fact, there's aliases. So when I'm typing dir or ls, I'm actually getting an alias for a PowerShell command called getChildItem. These are two different programs, right? But if we look at the properties, I'm going to click here and I'm going to click properties. We get this dialog. I think we've seen this dialog before, this kind of old-timey dialog box. It does not look like Windows 10 because it's been around for a very, very, very long time, okay? And if I click here in font, the only really interesting stuff that happened in this dialog box in the last 10 or 15 years were some improvements to the ability to see the fonts, okay? But if I look at the dialog properties for this one, look, it's the same thing. So it's clear that something is being shared between the DOS prompt here and the PowerShell prompt here. That is called console host, the con host. That's the terminal. That's the console. It's the thing that's responsible for the actual painting. Does the actual painting. Now, I started up PowerShell and I got this blue prompt here. But I could type command.exe. Now I'm here in DOS again. And then I could type command.exe again. I could type PowerShell again. Now I've nested my prompts and I could say exit, 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 exit. So it's important to point out and remember that the shells and the terminals are separate. And I wrote a blog post about this where I explain it in a little bit more detail. because people tend to conflate them. So we have to remember, what was a terminal, right? A terminal is something that is at the end, the terminal end of something. This was a terminal. You would have text in and text out. And this typewriter is responsible for the writing of the text, but the computer is the thing that's dealing with the strings, okay? This old one here, the one that's handling DOS and the one that's handling PowerShell, and it's not really DOS, I know. This one kind of historically sucks. It's very old, it paints weird. Notice that I tried to change my prompt and I put in kind of cool fonts. And when I run it in the old terminal, it looks weird because it doesn't understand how to use the right font. So I'm outputting the text, but it didn't work and it doesn't look correct. I think you can see that I successfully, for example, changed the background color here, but it's using the wrong glyph. Glyphs, those are called glyphs. Okay. Patrick Wu is doing their final school project while watching this. That may not be the best idea.
I'm just popping in with a question. Tobias is wondering, are there any repositories or collection of Windows terminal configs that you know about?
That is a good question. I don't know. From a config perspective, no. I know that there are terminal themes, and people have been starting to collect them so that you can go and find terminal color schemes. So Windows terminal themes.dev has a whole series of different colors and styles. And it's both light and dark. And then you can go by color and see all of those different things. And you can pick the different terminals and then download them and get those themes if you want to. Those themes are presented as JSON, and then you can change them. But for the configuration of the terminal, which we're going to see in a moment, things are a little bit more complicated. If I were to give you my terminal settings, it wouldn't work for you because the paths are going to be wrong and things like that. So that's a good question. There are theme collections, but I do not know of any collections of configurations.
Yeah, maybe there's a potential for someone in the community to look into that and maybe start a GitHub repository with shared configs. They might not be directly applicable, but you can get some inspiration, right?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of interesting options because we could potentially roam. We could roam the settings. You can imagine logging into GitHub, or I know that there's a blog post actually by Steve Lee from the PowerShell team, such that when he logs into PowerShell, his PowerShell calls GitHub, checks to see if he's changed his settings, and then brings down fresh settings. So, you know, there's lots of potential opportunities. Devesh Sangwan is talking about, is a shell like an interpreter? That's a great question. Exactly. So if I'm here in the command prompt and I type dir, it is interpreting that. Now, some shells can do things like this. That would be called a REPL, read, evaluate, print, loop, right? But the DOS prompt is not a REPL. I can't do 2 + 2. Let's try that over here. Can I do 2 + 2 in PowerShell? I can. So that's interesting. So yes, both of them are interpreters of sorts, but PowerShell is a better interpreter, and it's almost a REPL. So that's a great question from Devesh Sangwan. And I want to point out, of course, we're using the old terminal with the new shell, so we're having a bad experience there. So let's close these up, and let's open up the terminal. I'll open it up and bring it over from another monitor. Here we go. Cool. So look at this. Let's zoom in. Look at my prompt now. That's actually a glyph right there. So that's a glyph. That's a glyph. That's just a letter. There's 2 glyphs here with background colors, half width, and then that's a glyph. And that's coming out of what's called a nerd font. And if you go to nerdfonts.com, that is a font aggregator because what this does is it takes your favorite font and then it adds icons as glyphs inside that font. And then you can decide what are the fonts that you care about. So you can go and build them. So you go to font downloads, and what I've used myself is a modified version of what's called Cascadia Code. Cascadia Code is the new font that the Windows terminal comes with, but I use the nerd font version of that. And what they've done is they've patched it. They've chopped it up. Nils is asking about the heart. So the idea with the heart is that if I type something that is an error, then the heart turns red to indicate that it was an error result of 1. So you see the heart has turned color, and now it'll go back when I have a successful command. I've also modified the terminal to include icons. Then I've got these little colored icons here to tell me the types of the things. Now, if I go over to my GitHub, let's clear this out, make it larger, and go to GitHub, and I'll go to my website. So here is the prompt when we're looking at the a folder that's a Git folder. You can see my current Git branch, the GitHub logo, whether there's a modified or an unknown file, and then I've also got the current version of .NET in the folder that I'm in. And this is using a tool that's called posh. If you go to my blog, I believe I talked about both of these things, the terminal icons on my blog last week. And then if we go back to March, somewhere in here, we talk about posh, P-O-S-H, which is also at ohmyposh.dev. And I have a whole section on making a pretty prompt with that lovely stuff right there. Okay. Joaquim is asking if Windows Terminal is built with web technologies. It's actually not. There is a terminal that's built with web technologies. It's called Hyper. That was written by, forgot the gentleman's name, hyper.is. That is a web-based terminal. There's also xterm.js, which is a library for making a terminal. But Windows Terminal is written entirely in C++ and runs on Windows. And the reason that it is so fast is it's written like a game. It's basically using like DirectX to paint to the screen, so it can paint like 120 hertz, 144 hertz. So it's very, very, very fast. Now, Daniel Llewellyn is talking about the fork of the Inbox con host infrastructure. That brings up an interesting point. That's mostly true, but con host and the terminal are actually separated now because there's a thing called the sudo console. And there's a really interesting blog post that discusses that from Rich Turner in 2018. This is when it all started. So the creation of the sudo console, there's a great history lesson here if you want to get more into what Daniel is talking about, because they talk about what a terminal is, how the sudo terminal works, and it juxtaposes the difference between a terminal, the pseudo terminal that brokers the deal, and then the application or the shell that they're doing there. So to Joaquim's point, there's the console host, which is still kind of hidden and underneath there, which is now a pseudo console. Now, Windows originally did not have a pseudo console, which prevented this kind of stuff. And that's why we would use things like PuTTY, conemu, console too. But we wanted to make an ecosystem. We don't want to just make everyone use the Windows terminal. We want to make all terminals work well. So there needs to be that updated forked console host. So there's an actual ecosystem roadmap with a discussion about how other terminals, conemu, Hyper, etc., can plug in. There's a lot of really cool terminals out there, Terminus, etc. Just like on a Mac, you want to have lots of different terminals, lots of different choices. So the console host that Daniel mentions and the terminal are the difference between the pseudo console infrastructure and then the actual app that sits in front of it, like, you know, the Office document engine versus Word and Excel and things like that. So Daniel also points out, thank you very much, that it is open source. So the Windows terminal is open source and on GitHub. So thanks for that. Cool. So this here is a prompt. And remember that prompts can be changed, right? A prompt is just the thing that's prompting you for text. Prompts are very, very flexible. So we've got our shell, we've got our terminal, and then we've got our prompt. And that's the thing that asks you for text. And there's another great thing called Starship. And Starship is actually not a shell or a terminal. It's literally just a prompt. It's the thing that you would run in order to prompt the user for what they want to see. So you see this cool GIF right here where we've got like this nice prompt, and it's handling all that input, but it still works on anywhere. It works on Windows, works on Linux, etc. Bookstruck is saying that they want to make a pretty prompt for the Windows terminal. Yeah, you could go to the, you can, that question is a little confusing. So you want to make one, you're able to make, oh, I see, the Windows command prompt. So you want to do one for the Windows command prompt, not PowerShell. Yeah, that's a tough one. There's not a lot that you can do. So this here, this line right here is output by this. So if I say set prompt equals $P, $G, you know, and then I say like poop, I've now changed my prompt by setting this environment variable, and now it says poop every time. So if I wanted to change that, hey friends, right? So now I have this kind of weird prompt. I think I can try putting it in quotes. There you go. So that's now the new prompt. You can see I'm having to experiment a little bit to get it right. Doesn't always work the way you expect. Yeah, this is really old code. So the limitations are whatever you can put into this prompt variable. So if we search for customizing the DOS prompt and look for like $P, there is some limitations about what you can do. There's a couple of great blogs about tips and tricks, but ultimately, because you can't run an arbitrary bit of code, you can only change these characters here. So that's the list of things that you could potentially do. Each one of those symbols on the left represents things like, you know, the current drive in the path. Some people back in the day used to set their prompts with the current time. So you could go %T. Now each time I hit enter, I get the time. But yeah, the Windows command prompt is not really a configurable prompt. That's a great question, though. Thank you for that. Tobias Thornston is saying, can you compile the Windows terminal to be used everywhere? So any application, whether it be C or C++, can be compiled to work anywhere up until the point where it calls a native library. So the problem with the problem is not really a problem because it's called the Windows terminal. It's not the cross-platform terminal. Is that the code for this is dedicated. It's fundamentally attached to Windows itself. All the APIs that the Windows terminal does to do cool stuff are Windows APIs. You would have to have, Tobias, an abstraction layer to make the Windows terminal be completely separate from elsewhere. I think that a web technology like Hyper would be more appropriate for something like that. So yes, I think it would be very, very unlikely that the Windows terminal could be made cross-platform. Possible, there's always a possibility, but probably not a thing that would be very easy. Okay, so cool. So if we click on the Windows terminal up here, in the drop-down box, I've got all these different prompts. Now you know about the command prompt. We talked about that. There is the classic Windows PowerShell, and then there's PowerShell Core. And PowerShell Core now just called PowerShell because it's actually become the standard, you can find by looking for PowerShell in the Windows Store. I'm actually installing PowerShell and Windows Terminal, look at that, from the Windows Store. And that means it will always be up to date. Now, the Windows Terminal will automatically detect new shells on your system, and it will combine them. It'll add them to that menu right there. So if you were to install PowerShell, it would appear automatically. You don't need to do anything for that to show up. But there's other prompts here that are not new interpreters, right? They're just custom prompts, custom environments. I can add those. For example, git bash, click here on the start menu and we say git bash. That's installed with Git, and it's Cygwin, and I'll bring it up and show you what it looks like. It is not Linux, but it is an interesting prompt using a tool called mingw, and mingw lets it feel like Linux. I can type ls. I can't type top or htop because it's not Linux. This is actually running user mode Windows binaries, and I can go and find these files if I wanted to dig around. See, I just said where is ls? When I typed ls to list out my directory, well, that's literally a Windows executable called ls.exe. So I realize that this is a lot of detail, so tell me in the chat if you think it's interesting or not. But a lot of people will say things like, hey, Scott, why should I use WSL? That's stupid. I've got Cygwin. I've got git bash. I'll just use that. That's cool. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Your shell exists so that you can move around Windows, you can use Windows, and you can kick off existing stuff. Ashish Singh Bagal says, git bash is really cool. It makes a lot of tools work with Windows. That's a great point, right? It is cool. It makes tools work with Windows because it's a Windows application. And that's what's nice about git bash. But remember, it makes Windows feel Linuxy, but it's not Linux. And that's a really important thing. And Ashish knows that. What's nice, though, is that I can go and type like notepad.exe inside of git bash, and it runs the Windows app, which is what you would expect it to do because it's a Windows app. Now, this app here, this console, the thing that's doing the painting, look at this. That's not what I would expect, right? That's not using the classic console host, the con host infrastructure that Daniel was mentioning earlier. This is its own thing, right? Daniel points out that it is the minimalist GNU for Windows. Thank you for that. Exactly. It's user mode GNU utilities. It's not Linux. And it gives behaviors that are like a Unix or a GNU, but it's all exactly, it's using the Windows APIs. It's compiled against those Windows APIs. Nothing wrong with any of that. Now here's a cool tip for you, and Daniel will like this, and Ashish might enjoy it too. If you love git bash, I'm going to just click up here and click settings. We get some great insights from our friends here. Thank you for everyone who's bringing up these interesting comments and giving us more information than we would ordinarily have. I'm here in the settings of Windows Terminal, and take a look at this. I can just set the bash that comes with git bash as the command line, which means I can go like this, click git bash, and now I've got my mingw experience inside of the Windows Terminal. You can see I'm using Control Scroll. I can pick the fonts that I want. I can make the backgrounds and colors and stuff like that look great, right? So you get the best of all worlds. I could even hold down Alt. I'm going to take my left thumb here. I'm going to click on git bash while holding down Alt, and I've got mingw on the left, and I've got PowerShell on the right. So nice split screen right there. But moving beyond mingw, let's try to figure out what else one could potentially do. what we want to do is look at Windows Subsystem for Linux. So let me bring that back up. I accidentally closed that. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click Ubuntu 18.04, and this is the Windows Subsystem for Linux. This is an actual build of Ubuntu from Canonical. This is not from Microsoft. The Canonical provides this build. I'm using the LTS release. It's probably time for me to upgrade to Ubuntu 20.04. And you can see that I actually have multiple Linuxes installed. While I'm still using 18.04 as my primary, I could click on 20.04 and go over there. You see how fast that started? So I'm able to run multiple Linuxes all at the same time here inside of the Windows terminal because it's all just WSL. I can type in WSL-list-v, and you can see which ones are running and which ones are not. Okay. And whether they're stopped or started. And you can see even Docker is running in the background there. We can talk about that in a little bit. Okay. Now, this file system that I'm on right now, this is actually the Linux file system. If I type df, you can see that the Linux file system is there. We are in /home/Scott. We're not in C users Scott desktop. We are on a Linux file system. But we have mount points. We have mount points to my Windows drive. Let's look at the question here from Tor Hovland, who's saying that WSL is great for isolated Linux work, but when I'm operating on the same files from Windows. So that's a great question. When you are talking to these mount points, you're going to get a significant overhead, 3x or 5x speed decrease because you're going across a network share effectively, right? You've got, it's kind of complicated, but the WSL is running in this utility virtual machine. It's running in a tiny virtual machine. If I bring over the task manager, you can see that right now I'm running VM mem automatically. I've got two Linuxes running simultaneously right now, Ubuntu 18 and Ubuntu 20, and they're running in that utility VM. And it's not the same as Hyper-V. It starts instantly. And but when I talk to Mount C, I have to go through the Linux file system driver stuff that does mount points, then through WSL over to NTFS. And if I were going to do something like work with Node applications or work on Node modules, I'm going to pay quite the price. So if you're using Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL2, fast on the Linux file system. Linux, file system. Slow on the Windows file system. The original version of WSL, WSL1, slow on the Linux file system, fast on the Windows file system. Now, the team is working very hard to make those things fast in both cases. Nils points out very clearly that they are very different behind the scenes, and they have very different performance. So I use WSL1 on the WSL2 rather on the Linux file system for development. Okay. So then WebDancer08 says, when would I want to use WSL1? Well, WSL1 does not have a Linux kernel. It uses the Windows kernel. So you would want to use that for COM ports, USB devices, or talking to the Windows file system. I wrote a blog post. If you go to hanselman.com and search for WSL1, I did a blog post on COM ports because I do some Arduino work. If you want to talk to a serial COM port and you plug an Arduino into Windows, WSL1 is ideal for that. So you can see here in my Windows terminal, I actually connected Minicom, a WSL Linux terminal, to the COM port 4 so that I could actually click there and immediately talk to my device. I didn't want to talk to it with Arduino like this. I thought that was kind of sad and lame. So I have a whole list here about exactly how to do it. And now I'm talking to my device, my physical device. But when I plug in a COM port on Windows, it's connected to Windows. Okay, it's not connected to Linux. So for WSL 2, you would want to use that for for development, for Node, for Rust, for Python. Yeah, so Daniel is pointing out something interesting. Let's talk about that. So I'm in WSL, I'm on the command line. And remember how I said with Cygwin and with mingw, I could type notepad.exe and it would run, and that's kind of cool. So let's type notepad.exe inside of Linux, and I can run it. That's because we control things, right? So we can say, hey, I'm the Linux kernel. I don't know what that is. I'll let Windows handle it. Then the question would be, if I had a text file, like let's say I had, let's see, where's my, how about my bash RC? Could I open my bash RC in Notepad? We'll say notepad.exe. I have to say .exe. If I didn't say that, it's a Linux command. It doesn't know what's going on. So notepad.exe, bash RC. Do that. That's weird. So that is my bash RC in Linux, opened from Linux, running in Notepad. And notice that Notepad has been updated to understand your Linux line ending, so it won't mess these things up, which is pretty cool. Ronnie points out that WSL and WSL 1 and 2 can run in parallel. Absolutely. You can see here that I still have 2 Linuxes that are WSL 1. So in fact, yes, I have got WSL 1 and WSL 2 running in parallel. I could install Ubuntu twice and have one over there and one out of there. So yeah, it works great. So thank you for that question. That is a great great question and a good reminder. You can actually go WSL -- set version and indicate which one you want. It's not really super easy to switch back and forth, but it's absolutely possible. I would just say, if I'm doing light development, have an Ubuntu for light development on a hardware device like an Arduino, then yeah, have one lying around. But the other thing that's great about these is that you can export them. So Daniel could give me his, and I could use it. So I could go WSL export, and I could tar up or zip up my local user files, and then Daniel could give me his. So we could set up an environment and then share them. Now, Daniel made this point a moment ago. I'm going to go ahead and close my bash RC. How could I access these files here? Well, just like I typed in notepad.exe, what if I typed in explorer.exe with a dot? That dot indicates the current directory. Look at this. So now I'm in the Windows Explorer on this WSL network share. And what we're doing here is we're running what's called a Plan 9 server, and we're doing a network hop, except it's all local. So I can access my Ubuntu files from here if I wanted to. Now, from a development perspective, from a pure performance perspective, everyone has mentioned this in the chat, Nils has mentioned it, Daniel's mentioned it, that if you stay on the file system that you know to be performant, you're going to have a better experience. So just to be clear, WSL2 is wicked fast, almost native speed on the Linux file system. But as soon as you cross over, if I were to switch here and to go cd mount C, and now I'm on Windows file system, someone should actually make a prompt that warns you that what you're doing is probably a bad idea. Like Windows Subsystem for Linux should detect that you're doing that and say that's a bad idea. Francisco Javier Luzcampa is saying, is this running on a lightweight Hyper-V? It is, in fact. That's a great question. Just a reminder, it's running inside of VMM right now. So I've got 2 Linuxes that are running in this one, just about 1.5 GB memory space. And that will actually increase and decrease, and I can set the memory limits. And Daniel makes a great point. Let's actually go into the Windows features area here, if you go to Windows features, turn Windows features on and off, it's a little confusing. This does not need to be on. This is super important. If you have a student in your life, you do not need Hyper-V as a Windows component to run WSL. This is explicitly important. Hyper-V is included in Windows 10 Pro, but a lot of students have Windows 10 Home, or you may have Home at home, and you don't want to pay for Pro. So Hyper-V, when you click that, what you're actually asking for is for the Hyper-V manager and all of that stuff that lets you run virtual machines. These, pardon me, these are actual virtual machines. That is not WSL. In fact, the WSL virtual machines are not even seen inside of Hyper-V. The things that you need to turn on are the virtual machine platform, the Windows Subsystem for Linux, and this is a really weird thing. There's the virtual machine platform and the Windows Hypervisor platform. Yes, exactly. Ashish is saying that he's got Windows Home at home and runs WSL. Works just great. You just need to turn on the Hypervisor platform and the Windows Subsystem for Linux, and you'll be able to run it just fine. Hyper-V sits on top even more. Tor Hovland is pointing out that they never even thought about WSL1. It absolutely comes down to the use cases. That's a great point. The idea that there are things that WSL1 can do that I can't do in WSL2. If all my source code is over in Windows, maybe I might want to do that. But let me show you how I do my development. So I've got my local, I'm going to go ahead and go home. Here's the Hanselman website. Okay, so this is literally hanselman.com. I am inside of Ubuntu, just a reminder. I'm running .NET, and if I actually look for .NET, you can see that it's running in user bin.NET. It's not C program files. And I could say .NET build, and I can build my application, and it works just great, and I can run it from here. I am on the Linux file system. It might seem attractive to you to go to C, mount, whatever, GitHub, and try to do that work like this. Do not do that. It's always going to be 10 times slower. So what I do is I've got the exact same thing. This is now on Windows. So we're back over in Windows, my friends. Here's the same code. .NET build. Runs, works great. And I can do it in Windows, but it's in a totally different path. So I just, if I need to, I git push and I git pull between the two. That allows me to keep things straight. So when I go and do my, my git pull to make sure that this is up to date, and I hope it is. No, in a moment, it is up to date. Cool. I should be able to do the same thing over here. Git pull. Oops, I'm on the wrong. See, like I'm in the wrong folder. Git pull. Up to date as well. Git status. Oh, interesting. What change did I make there? Oh, white space. That doesn't matter. All right, cool. So that's really interesting. Now, here's the part, though, that is interesting. If I'm in WSL and I want to do the edits, I could go notepad, startup.cs, notepad.exe, make those changes. What I'm really going to do is I'm going to type code for Visual Studio Code and and I'm going to run Visual Studio Code. Mr. Kecken, how about GUI applications? Yes, very, very soon. Watch for announcements. We should be hearing about GUI apps soon. Remember that build is around the corner, but you should hear more information about GUI apps soon. Remember to make sure that your PCs are on Insiders and that you're ready for it. Francisco is asking, does WSL have any impact on resources if you're not running them? No. That's a great point. This is a gaming PC that I'm on. if it's not running, it's not running. In fact, I can go out here, as we saw before, and I can say WSL-list-v. I can see what's running, okay? And I can say WSL-help and -shutdown. So WSL-shutdown, and it shuts it all down. It won't be running at all if nothing is started up. But yes, that makes sure that everyone is not running. It's handled, uses 0 resources when it is not using. Yeah, we should have GUI application announcements very soon. Yeah, Tor, you're just going to have an even better experience. It's going to be nice when it works. You won't have to wait very long. You won't have very long. X410 is definitely the best one. So Tor is pointing out that he's using a Linux GUI app like IntelliJ IDEA. Absolutely. What I'm doing here, though, is I've run code, Visual Studio code, from the command line inside of Linux. This is where something really weird and interesting happens. Notice that VS Code server splits in half. It just split in half. And now it's updating the Visual Studio Code server locally. So now I actually have a half of Visual Studio Code running in /home/Scott VS Code server, and the other half over here in Windows. We'll talk about that in just a second. Hayashi was saying, was I running a WSL command? So I'm over here in PowerShell. Just to make the point, we'll open up like old style DOS, and I'll type where WSL.exe, and you can see it's in Windows System 32. So this is just a utility. So WSL-help is a utility for managing your distributions, and that's a Windows utility. So you run that from the Windows side of things. So yeah, I'm running a management thing. So this is the default distribution. It's running version 2. If I started up Alpine, for example, I could say WSL-D for distribution, Alpine. Now I'm running Alpine. I could hit exit. We'll do a list. You can see now Alpine is running. Great question from Hayashi Esme. Cool. So back to Linux. We launched code. Here's Visual Studio Code. Here's that same startup.cs that we saw before, except I've got syntax highlighting and all that kind of good stuff. But in the lower left-hand corner here in Visual Studio Code, it actually says WSL Ubuntu. So it knows that we are connected to WSL. And that allows us to run a Windows app. We're running it on Windows, but it's split in half. So there's a client-server relationship here. Client-server relationship. Here's the freaky part. If I click File, I'm going to click Open File here. Okay? File, Open File. This dialog box is in Visual Studio Code is giving me the Linux file system. Okay? We'll do that again. File, Open File. These are all Linux file systems. I can go and open up specific pages and see those pages. But I could go and say File, Open File, Show Local. Show Local. And that pops up my local file system stuff. So it blurs the lines a little bit. Okay? Here's even cooler. Inside of Visual Studio Code, I'm going to hit Control tilde, and look. Now I am talking to a terminal. Now this is using xterm.js, but this is, and I am now looking at a shell of my Linux distribution, but I'm staying inside of Visual Studio Code. So some people might want to Alt-Tab back and forth. Other people might want to do this, but I could even run htop inside of Visual Studio Code, and I can see all the different stuff that's running, including my Visual Studio extensions. This is a really interesting and really important thing to understand, because if we click on extensions here, there are 38 local extensions. Those are extensions that are installed on Windows. Those are Windows extensions, okay? And then there are 6 installed inside of WSL on Ubuntu. So these 6 are inside. I've got C#, I've got Docker, I've got Python and Jupyter, C++ running location transparently, meaning that the Visual Studio Code doesn't care that they don't even live here. And then I've got 38 extensions that are inside. What this means is that I could potentially have .NET running and installed on Linux and not even have it at all anywhere on my Windows machine. So that when I'm in my startup.cs here, for example, and I say like app dot, as soon as I hit dot and it pops up this IntelliSense, it gives me a list of stuff. That list, who gave me that? That's not Windows. That is the Visual Studio Code server that's running over inside of WSL that's providing me that stuff. So what this means is it means that the language services are remoted. They're remoted. They're running inside of WSL. So that is the ideal way to use WSL. Now, if I go over to Visual Studio proper, Visual Studio for Windows, while we don't have yet the ability to talk directly to WSL, the WSL file system, what I can do is this. I'm going to open up my Windows file system because that's what Visual Studio understands today. I'll open up the Hanselman website. This is like literally my personal website. Okay. WSL2 can appear inside Visual Studio for Windows. And I can hit F5 and I can debug from Visual Studio proper, not Visual Studio Code, into WSL2 interactive debugging, which gives me the ability now to take an application and test it on IIS Express, on Kestrel, which is the built-in web server for .NET, and WSL. And Daniel notices that I was using DOSBlog. It's worth pointing out that if you go to GitHub, our buddy Mark Downey has taken DOSBlog with minimal help from me, and Mark has converted it to .NET Core. So then I have a fork of that, and he and I are upgrading my blog together. A couple of days ago, I fixed a pipeline. And if you go to hanselman.com/blog and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can see that my blog, which is now almost 20 years old, is running on .NET Core 3.1. You can see actually a link to the commit in GitHub and the actual build in Azure DevOps as well. So DOSBlog is running on Linux on .NET Core in the cloud right now, which is cool.
Just gonna butt in here and let you know that there are 5 minutes left. You had another meeting you had to run to, right?
Yeah, I actually have to go and record Azure Friday.
Yeah. So how do you have control on time?
I have no control of the time because the producers and the people over there have to, they're waiting for me. Let me see here if there's any other questions here. I actually don't know the question. There's a question here from WebDancer08. How can you make services keep running when you exit the Ubuntu shell like Docker? Well, so there's 2 questions there. How do you make Docker work is an implied question. How do you make services keep running? I don't believe that there is a way yet for long-running services. There are some hacks, maybe Nuno in the chat there. Okay, so Nuno, Corsair is saying that the processes stay alive until you terminate the distro. So you're saying, Nuno, if I start up a process in the background outside of my shell, that process keeps keeps running and it'll never go away. So then you're saying that if it's running in user mode, it'll keep the process going. You just have to start it yourself, because I know that there's some systemd hacks. Apparently, Nalux is disappointed that Azure Friday is not live. I'm afraid not. Done over 500 episodes of Azure Friday, and it's not always live. Yes, cool. Thank you, Daniel and Nuno, for that help. Now, Docker though is a different issue. So if we go over here and we do our WSL list again, we can see that Docker is running. This is actually a very clever architecture, in my opinion. What's going on here is that Docker has created their own instance of a WSL2, so Docker can be running even if Ubuntu is not running. Ubuntu, in this case here, is just my default distro. By allowing themselves to manage their own distro, then Docker Desktop will keep running. So when I run the Docker Desktop application here on my other monitor, I'll bring it over from this monitor. I can do things like Docker images. I can see all my images, even going back a very long time. I can see images, dev environments, running containers, all here in the Docker environment. And I can go to Ubuntu over here, and I can run Docker images and see those as well. And I'm sharing now. I'm sharing the same instance of Docker in Windows and in Ubuntu, but I'm doing it because Docker manages its own. So you don't have to worry about keeping Dockerd running, because Docker Desktop on Windows is handling that for you. Okay. Firewall rule to call the X server from WSL. I don't know about the virtual network thing. Talk to Craig Llewellyn about that, but I will say that all of my networking issues have gone away because I'm using Tailscale. So I'm using Tailscale to do my networking more easily. The meta point that's being commented out here in the very active chats in YouTube are that the Hyper-V network that is being managed underneath WSL keeps getting recreated, so it's a little bit confusing. And you can't always count on your IP addresses and your name and your network. But Tailscale is a really cool mesh-based network, and it works great inside WSL. So I could be doing development, make a website, call that website from my phone, from Safari on my phone, and do my testing. Ordinarily, doing that, doing the network traversal for us, and Tailscale handles that. Daniel Llewellyn is reminding me that it's Craig Lowen. Sorry, too many L's. There's like 9 L's in your name, so I apologize for that, my friend. Thank you for that reminder. All right, I think that is the end of my talk, but I want to point out something really interesting. In the chat here, we've got some great resources. You've got Daniel, Nuno, Nils, and others who are WSL experts. Put your Twitter handles in the YouTube chat and continue the conversation over on Twitter, because you've got some really cool people here with a lot of really cool experiences. So I would encourage our friends in the chat to get together and network outside. I don't know, WebDancer08, why you are making a point of not using Docker Desktop. It manages a lot of stuff for you. It is very, very, very convenient. So I would encourage you to maybe rethink that. Cool. Last thing I'd like you to do is just take a look at my YouTube channel and subscribe. I've got some cool stuff up there. Maybe our friends at this conference will let me stick this website up there, this conference chat up there as well. Cool. You popped in and then you left, my friend.
Yeah.
First time.
I just wanted to say that was an excellent session. Thank you so much. I always pick up so many weird new things by watching your stuff. I love it. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming and sharing this awesome stuff with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been great. And I would also thank the audience so much for all these great questions and all the great discussions going on in the comments. That was really good to see. So, any last words, Scott, before going?
I just want everyone to, I think it's wonderful that our friends in the chat are helping each other and they're sharing their Twitter stuff. This is a really great example of what makes user groups great, is that it's not like Scott's an expert, here's how things work. It's here's how things work for me, here's how I understand things, and then Daniel and Tor and Nuno and Ashish and Jonah and WebDancer and on and on and on are all correcting me, giving me insight. I learned something new about how things work. And then we all as a team, as a community, help each other. And I think that's really what it's all about. So I want to remind people also that I'm sure you would agree, people in the chat, maybe they contact you all and they can speak at this user group sometime.
Yes, please do. If you have something that you want to share, don't be afraid to contact us and propose your topic. We would love to have knowledgeable speakers on NNUG.
Very cool. All right, I will see you all later. I have to disappear, but thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much. Bye.